For decades, you have been fed the line that World War II was a war of ideologies, a battle of democracy against dictatorship. Forget that nonsense. The fate of humanity was decided in grimy chemical retorts, where the Nazis attempted to turn ordinary coal into blood for their tanks. What was at stake was not a new order, but the elementary survival of mechanisms. By 1941, Germany resembled an athlete on steroids with a heart defect. The Reich had the world's best engineers and a well-drilled army, but it lacked the most vital thing, not a single drop of its own oil. Without fuel, the Blitzkrieg turned into a parade of stationary targets. While Hitler shuddered in speeches about the greatness of the nation, his generals, in a cold sweat, studied graphs. The tanks were emptying faster than territories were being captured. Germany was trapped inside a technological illusion, trying to cheat geography with chemistry. Either they find oil outside of Europe, or their empire simply stalls in the first deep puddle. The world did not even suspect that all the vaunted power of the Wehrmacht rested on a single chemical formula, which ultimately lured the Nazis into the deadly trap of Stalingrad. The Germans were the first in history to accomplish what seemed like alchemical madness. They learned to fuel tanks with ordinary brown coal. It was a technical triumph that was supposed to erase the boundaries between resources and make the Reich invulnerable to naval blockades. Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch cracked the code of energy independence. In giant secret plants, coal was subjected to extreme pressure and temperature, literally squeezing surrogate fuel out of it. The rest of the world, heavily addicted to the oil needle, initially only scoffed. But in 1939, the irony ended. German tank wedges tore deep into Europe precisely on this synthetic ration. Germany demonstrated that it did not care about the British fleet blocking oil supplies as long as there was a piece of coal in its depths. But this stone blood had one fatal flaw. Its production devoured Germany's own resources so quickly that the synthetic miracle began to turn into an economic noose. The seizure of France, Poland, and the Benelux countries solved none of Berlin's problems. On the contrary, the brilliant victories of 1940 drove Hitler into a logistical dead end from which there was only one way out, and it led to the east. With every new occupied country, the appetites of the Reich's war machine grew exponentially. It was necessary not only to fuel tanks at the front, but also to maintain life in captured cities, run trains, and ensure industrial operations. The synthetic plants worked at the limit of physical capability, but the army expanded faster than chemists could build new reactors. Hitler found himself in the role of a mad runner who requires more and more oxygen with every step, while the volume of his tank rapidly decreased. Europe had been eaten, but it turned out to be empty. It had many museums, but critically little oil. The only chance to save the Reich from an inevitable halt was the black blood of the Caucasus, and Hitler understood. If he did not reach the wells soon, his steel fist would simply turn into a pile of immobile scrap metal. The invasion of the USSR was not an abstract quest for Lebensraum, as portrayed in movies. It was a desperate, driven-to-madness raid on the world's largest gas station. Without seizing Soviet rigs, Hitler would become bankrupt by the following winter. Hitler did not hide his true goals from his generals. He directly stated that if he did not get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, the war would have to be wound down. Moscow, in this regard, was merely a backdrop, a political symbol. The real prize, for which the Wehrmacht strained its sinews, was in the south. The entire scenario of Operation Barbarossa was built on a mathematical calculation. Seize the wells in the first months, otherwise Fischer-Tropsch synthetic fuel would run out before the German boot finished marching to the Urals. The Reich went all in, betting everything on a single filling station of global proportions. But Stalin saw this oil hunger of the enemy perfectly. He was preparing a trap in which the last resource reserve of the Nazi machine was to burn, turning its triumphal march into agony. Why did Hitler cling to the ruins of the city on the Volga with such maniacal persistence, losing entire armies there? He did not need Stalingrad as a point on a map. He needed to sever the main artery through which the life of the entire Soviet country flowed. Stalingrad was the key valve. Hitler understood. If he blocked the Volga at this point, he would not just capture a city bearing the enemy's name. he would leave the entire Red Army without Caucasian fuel. This was the moment of absolute truth. By taking Stalingrad, the Germans gained an open path to the oil fountains of Baku and simultaneously doomed the USSR to fuel paralysis. It was an all-or-nothing battle. If the Reich takes this line, it fuels its death machine for decades to come and becomes invincible. If not, its vaunted panzers turn into rusting monuments to German vanity. In the basements and on the streets of Stalingrad, it was decided whether the world tomorrow would speak German while fueling up on synthetics, or if the Nazi beast would finally die of thirst right on the doorstep of an oil paradise. The Germans reached the foothills of the Caucasus. They saw the rigs through binoculars and were already preparing for an oil triumph. But over thousands of kilometers traveled, they never managed to refuel a single tank. The oil paradise turned out to be a movie set. When the lead units of the Wehrmacht burst into Maikop, a gruesome sight awaited them. Instead of working rigs, there was twisted iron, and instead of oil lakes, there were blown up and permanently cemented wells. Soviet engineers applied scorched earth tactics in their most high-tech form. Hitler's brilliant plan for rapid refueling at the enemy's expense failed miserably. Instead of fountains of black gold, the Nazis got a logistical nightmare. Now they had to transport every liter of synthetic gasoline from Germany over broken roads across half of Europe. At that moment, coal fuel turned from a salvation into a death sentence. The logistical chain began to devour more resources than it managed to deliver to the front lines. Do you know what the main irony of the Eastern Front was? To deliver 1 ton of gasoline to the front line near Stalingrad, a German truck consumed almost as much fuel along the way. The system began to devour itself. Germany was suffocating in its own logistics. Due to the catastrophic lack of oil, the Wehrmacht had to resort to humiliating measures, using wood gas generators and mobilizing millions of horses, as in the Middle Ages. But tanks, planes, and trucks required only high-quality fuel produced by plants deep in the rear. Consequently, every liter of fuel became worth its weight in gold. The entire power of the Luftwaffe was now tied not to supporting infantry, but to guarding endless columns of barrels. The German war machine turned into a giant serpent that, out of hunger, began to swallow its own tail. While Guderian's tanks froze in the steppes without a drop of fuel, the Allies were preparing the final blow to the very heart of the coal empire, where those synthesis reactors stood. The war was won not only by tank crews in the steppes near Prokhorovka, but also by Allied pilots who methodically burned out the Fischer-Tropsch plants. They realized, you don't need to destroy every tank individually, it is enough to deprive it of the ability to move. By 1944, the Allies finally realized where the Reich's Achilles heel lay. The operation for the total dismantling of German chemistry began. Massive raids on the giant synthetic fuel complexes turned production into flaming ruins. Germany went blind and stalled in the literal sense. The Luftwaffe's newest jet fighters rotted at airfields because there wasn't enough kerosene even to warm up the engines before takeoff. The great technological breakthrough that was supposed to make Hitler the master of the world became his main vulnerability. Huge industrial giants turned into ideal targets that were impossible to hide or protect. At that moment, it became clear an empire built on a coal crutch was doomed to rapid collapse. Hitler's last large-scale offensive in 1944 was planned not on his own resources, but on captured American gasoline. This was the limit of technological humiliation. The greatest army in the world had turned into a gang of marauders prowling for a jerrycan. When you have no fuel of your own, the only chance to survive is to steal it from the enemy. In December 44, German tank crews in the Ardennes were issued maps with special markings. These were not enemy positions, but Allied fuel depots. This was a strategy of absolute desperation. The German command understood, if they did not capture American barrels in the first 48 hours, their offensive would simply stall in the woods. And so it happened. As soon as the Americans managed to set fire to their depots during the retreat, the newest King Tigers turned into useless iron boxes. The crews abandoned functional machines and left on foot because the wind was whistling in their tanks. An empire that dreamed of ruling the planet through synthetic alchemy ended up abandoning its finest technological masterpieces simply because they had nothing to feed their engines. Why, if the Germans learned to make gasoline from stone 80 years ago, do we still depend on the whims of oil monarchies and prices at the pump? You won't like the answer. This secret is too expensive for peacetime. The Fischer-Tropsch technology was a miracle born in hell. After the war, the blueprints for the German plants fell into the hands of the victors, but a mass coal paradise never materialized. Why? Because synthetic gasoline is an ecological and economic nightmare. The process requires a monstrous amount of energy and water, and the output is a product several times more expensive than natural oil. Germany resorted to this out of absolute desperation while trapped in a steel ring of blockade. As soon as access to cheap wells opened up, coal blood became unprofitable. The technology was dismissed as a military crutch, needed only by dictatorships that decided to fight the whole world alone. But do not rush to consign it to the archives. Today, in an era of sanction wars and resource shortages, folders marked "Secrets of the Reich" are being reopened in the closed laboratories of countries preparing for their own blockades. World War II proved one cruel truth. Any ideology, even the most fanatical, is powerless against the laws of physics and chemistry. Tanks do not run on slogans, and planes do not fly on pure hatred. Hitler lost not because his generals were stupider or his soldiers weaker. His empire collapsed because its energy foundation was artificial. Stalingrad became the graveyard of Nazi ambitions precisely because it was a battle of a real resource against a synthetic imitation. The entire course of 20th century history was determined by whose wells pumped oil longer and more stably. Fischer-Tropsch synthetic gasoline gave Germany the audacity to start the war, but it also guaranteed its shameful end in a protracted struggle of attrition. Today's global race for lithium, chips, and rare metals looks exactly like the battle for Caucasian oil in '42. We are once again on the threshold of a moment when someone's batteries will simply run out in the middle of a fight. The history of the gasoline war is not just a chronicle of the past, it is a blueprint for our near future. He who controls energy today is already assigning roles for the next global clash. We are used to believing that new technologies make us free and independent. But the example of the Third Reich shows the opposite. They only create a new, even more rigid dependence on resources. If tomorrow someone cuts off access to a critically important element, your smart homes, electric cars, and cloud services will turn into the same piles of useless junk that the German tigers became in the Ardennes. The world is an endless struggle for the right to be fueled, and the rules in it have not changed since the days of the first coal reactors. Remember, the one who is free is not the one with the weapon, but the one with the key to the gas station. Subscribe to understand which element of the periodic table will be the reason they make us hate each other tomorrow. Until next time in the next investigation.